to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome again to the Language Fuel podcast. If you're listening for the first time, we welcome you. If you're a regular listener, thanks for tuning in once again. Now, this podcast today is part 2 in a 3-part series on classroom management. If you haven't heard part 1, I do encourage you to go ahead and stop what you're listening to now and go back and listen to that one, because this really won't make a huge amount of sense unless you have listened to the first one. So what we're doing is I am looking at classroom management through the lens of leadership, because I truly believe that classroom management is really a matter of managing student engagement with the teacher, and the only way that students will engage with a teacher is when the teacher is truly leading them. If a leader is doing their job, they will follow. So I'm couching classroom management from a leadership perspective, and the lens through which I'm looking at leadership I've borrowed from John C. Maxwell, and I will put links to where you can buy his book. It's The 5 Levels of Leadership. I'll put links in the show notes for you if you're interested in reading that book. John Maxwell focuses mainly on leadership in the workplace, although he does acknowledge the role of classroom teacher as a leader as well. So this is definitely within the intentions he had for his 5 levels. Last time I mentioned about levels 1 and 2. Level 1 is position. So we talked about the idea that, you could get a position of being a classroom teacher, but that doesn't necessarily mean much at all. Sometimes it does mean that you've had excellent training in order to get that position, but I'm very conscious of the fact that some people will have a position without necessarily having a huge amount of training behind them. It's the very bottom of the leadership ladder. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a good leader. The second level is then permission, where people, or in this case, students, give you the permission to lead them. And that's the very next step after positional leadership. It's very important. If you don't have that permission, then nothing else really works here. So if you didn't listen to that one, that's why I encourage you to make sure you have gained the permission. And another way of saying it is that you've earned the respect of your students. So we talked about things like being yourself, being authentic, an authentic leader. We mentioned things like learning their names, using eye contact, welcoming them into the classroom, seeing them as individuals, respecting them, and learning to develop a relationship with them, allowing yourself to be known to a certain extent in order to develop a genuine relationship there. All right, so assuming that you've caught up with the level 2 and have taken steps to develop a relationship and earn that respect and trust, we then are going to talk today about level 3. Now, John Maxwell talks about level 3 as being production. He does, of course, use P's. I'm sure there's different ways we could call this, but really at this stage is where the work gets done. This is where leadership just does its job and things actually happen. So in the classroom, of course, that means that students get on with their learning, activities are actually being achieved. So you're really getting the engagement that you desire. And I've broken my advice to get to this level, or to work on at this level, into 1, 2, 3 main categories, and then a couple of caveats at the end. There are 3 main categories of advice that I'd like to give you at this level. I'd like you to think about the environment that you're in. I'd like to think about your teacher guidance, and also to think about planning. These are 3 major things that you have influence over that can assist you to be productive at this stage. So first of all, let's think about the environment. I want to think about the physical environment and the social environment. So in terms of the physical environment, you may be in a situation where you can't necessarily change that physical environment, but usually there are things that you can do to take control and make it a good physical environment for learning. So I'm thinking about moving chairs around. You could move the environment so that if you tell people that they need to work in pairs, well, when the chairs are already arranged in groups of two, that's much easier for them to follow those instructions, right? It seems very simple, but think about ways that you can design your environment so that following your instructions is sort of automatic. It's easy. Nobody needs to think about it. They're just going to do it. So moving chairs around. You might want to have pair work. You might want to have group work. You might want to put people on opposite ends of the classroom for a particular activity and then swap them over or something like that. So be conscious of moving chairs, moving tables and things like that. Put posters on the wall. Make the environment look like this is a place where learning gets done. Reference material on the wall. Charts of pronominal endings for verbs or something like that. Because sometimes people don't work actually because they've forgotten key parts of the process. So if you're trying to have a discussion and you cannot for the life of you remember what prefix is supposed to go on the verb or which suffix is supposed to go on the verb, but you can quickly look up onto the wall, see a poster with all the relevant information, then you can carry on. So make information accessible. Celebrate the learning by putting up student work. That gives a message very clearly to your students that you value what they are producing and that sort of thing. Of course, moving the tables as well, if they're not fixed, obviously. Some people like to teach in a U-shaped so that the teacher has access to a lot of the students. Some like to say, well, no, students should be working in groups most of the time, so they put tables in groups. So think about, and you might change it for each lesson as you plan for it. So think about chairs, tables, posters, whatever. Remove things from the environment as well. You don't want distractions in your room. And of course, make it a calm room if you can, if you have things that you can do to decorate it or to make it a calm and happy place. So take charge of your physical environment. That definitely helps. And then, of course, there's the social environment that you, as the teacher in the room, need to manage as well. So things like warming the students up to each other. Every lesson you need to have a warmer activity so students are encouraged to mix. They shouldn't be sitting with the same people all the time. They shouldn't be doing the speaking exercises with the same people all the time. Mix it up. Encourage them. Play games where they have to mix, where they have to get to know each other, and that will just warm them up to one another. Make sure students are taught to respect one another as well. If ever you hear a student say something disrespectful, nip it in the bud immediately, and we'll talk a bit later about how you can handle negative behavior. But never ever let disrespect flourish in your classroom. And then in terms of the social environment as well, help them develop confidence. Help them feel safe by giving them confidence in knowing what to do. And this brings me on to my next point, which is about your teacher guidance. Your instructions must be super clear. If your instructions are clear and everybody knows what to do, then nobody's going to feel nervous and kind of scared. Oh, am I doing the right thing? Is that what I'm supposed to do? That's not a good environment either. So your teacher talk is very important, and we had a whole podcast episode looking at teacher talk. You can search through and look at that if you haven't heard that one before. But, very simple, plain language in terms of the words that you're using to give those instructions. And concept check them. So as well as giving them, you've got to make sure that they were understood. Did the instructions land with as they should have landed? So ask yes or no questions or closed-ended questions to make sure they definitely had the idea. Accompany your instructions with body language, and as much as possible, replace your verbal instructions with body language. So sit down, stand up, talk to your neighbor. The things that you say often, develop a little sign language system, and soon you'll just be moving your hands and students will know exactly what's expected of them. You shouldn't be talking too much. Too much language just confuses people, so do avoid that. And also I would say in terms of your instructions is think about your presence. your teacher presence should be consciously planned. And what I mean by that, you could think of, say, micro versus macro management. You don't necessarily want to be micromanaging your students. You don't want to be hanging around all the time because that can make them feel uncomfortable. So plan to have times when you are close by and you're looking and working in the groups with them, and to have times when you're not very close by. You can even make up excuses why you need to leave the room, or excuses why you need to stand at the back, or whatever it is, so that they have experience of having some control as well over their activities and not being, watched all of the time. So those are some tips for your teacher instructions. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is lesson planning. Again, a massive, important aspect of teaching anything, but certainly teaching language. We did talk about a lesson planning process in another podcast, so again, feel free to go back and listen to that if you'd like. But just a couple of things around lesson planning. If your own mind is organized and you know how you want to spend your time, it'll come through and the class will feel seamless and they'll feel more comfortable to engage with you. So things like signposting your lessons. Let them know what you're going to do. First, we're going to do this. Second, we're going to do that. Third, we're going to do this. And at the end of class, we're going to do that. You might even want to write it on the board so everybody knows where we're at in the stage of the lesson. Plan lots of different interactions within your lesson. So it's not always teacher talking to students. It really shouldn't be that. But sometimes it's pair work, student to student. Sometimes it's group work, groups of 4 or 5 working together. Sometimes it's the students telling the whole group, things like that. So make sure you vary the actions. Keep your timing under control. So tell them, hey, we're going to talk for 5 minutes. And don't let that stretch on to 10 minutes because it's exhausting. Keep your word. Tell them 5 minutes. Set a timer. The timer goes off. We're done. So, plan, keep to time. Close off those interactions well. So again, right, our time is up. Let's move on. I love using a timer, by the way, because then it's not the teacher having to stop it. It's, oh, look, the timer rang. So it's a third party, if you like, stopping them. You can use, obviously, a mobile phone timer. I used to have a bell that I would ring. I guess this was before technology and so on. So it's a non-confrontational way to let them know it's time to move on to the next activity. So all of that has to do with lesson planning. So if you get your environment right, physical environment and social environment, if your guidance is very clear and very understandable and easy to follow, and if your lesson planning is good, you have a really good chance of succeeding in leading the class to do what it is that you're asking them to do, in which case learning will also happen. So there's definitely a lot of, positive things there, but I guess the big question is, what about when negative things do crop up? And despite your best planning and managing the environment and great teacher talk, there will be times when students exhibit negative behavior. So how do you manage that actively? So I've got a few things to mention here, 4 things. First of all, super clear expectations. Let your students know what it is you expect of them. Hey, when someone's talking at the front of the class, I expect everybody to be quiet. Very simple. Let them know what you want. If they don't know what you want, you can't blame them for not giving it to you. Hey, when I say work in pairs, I expect you to turn next to the person next to you and answer the question. I mean, it sounds very simple, but a lot of people don't make their expectations clear. So that's the absolute fundamental thing. You cannot punish anyone for doing something where they were unsure about the expectations. And then, of course, you do need to intervene as required. So I'd like to think about how you intervene when something goes wrong. So like I said earlier, you do need to nip things in the bud as soon as it starts to happen. Stop it immediately so that nothing becomes habitual in your students. Now, interventions can be tiny, and that's great. It could be just, hey, catching the eye of a student who starts to do something that they know they shouldn't do. It could be maybe raising your eyebrow at that student, so hey, they're aware you're communicating in some way. So those things are wonderful. Any non-verbal gestures that you can make helps. Even walking, close to them, just walking by a little bit closer than normal helps the student realize, you've got my attention, something's, not quite right. If you can intervene non-verbally, do it non-verbally. Let's avoid confrontation if at all possible. However, sometimes you may need to intervene in a bigger way if a subtle message doesn't get through. So before you think about how to intervene in big ways, I want you to think very carefully about the size of the problem that you're dealing with, because if it's a small matter, let's make sure our intervention is small and appropriate. But if it's a really serious matter, we need to make sure our intervention is in fact serious to match what's going on. So things like small disruptions. Someone's checking a cell phone, somebody's whispering to their neighbor. These are really small fry issues. Let's just do something non-verbal where we can, so that's where we catch their attention. Perhaps we go close. Perhaps we just distract the person rather than confronting the issue. So John is speaking to Mary over in the corner. Just say, "Hey John, what did you think of the activity we just did?" So again, you're not confronting his behavior, you're just distracting him, getting him back on track. That is so much easier than anything else. The next level up, apart from a small disruption, would be what I would call poor behavior. So what I would say is, that's someone perhaps disrespecting a neighbor verbally, saying something that's not appropriate, not participating when they really should, and everybody else is participating. So you know that the instructions actually were clear because everyone else is doing it. Something like that. I'd like to suggest that often poor behavior is the result of something different. There could be an underlying issue with that person. Maybe they're exhausted because they've been doing too many after-school activities on the weekend or whatever. Maybe they're upset. Something social's happened to them and they're trying to deal with that. And so this is how it's coming out. So deal with the current behavior, and that could be in private, saying, "Hey, look, I notice you're not on task today," or "I notice you mentioned something a little bit disrespectful to your neighbor. That's not appropriate in my classroom." So you deal with it. You mention what it is, the behavior that you don't appreciate, and ask them to stop. Most of the time, that's enough. Do it in private. But I would say if there is an underlying issue, it could be worth talking about it later. "Hey, you know what? I've noticed that for the last several days you've been really distracted and it's taken you a long time to get involved with the activities. Is there anything I can do to help?" Just to let the person know that you care about them. And if there is, a social issue, you might want to refer them to the guidance counselor at school or whatever methods of escalation you have at your institution. And it's worth, knowing what they are. But just the fact that you as the teacher have inquired about the student's well-being, it makes them feel appreciated, and that solidifies your relationship again, earning you the permission to lead that student again. So don't underestimate the power of just checking in with a student after class or something like that. So we talked about small disruptions, we talked about poor behavior. The next level up, I guess, is really unacceptable behavior. So I'm talking about things like perhaps abuse or even theft, physical abuse, theft, something absolutely unacceptable. And that would be unacceptable in any place, not just your classroom. We're not really talking about a classroom activity anymore. We're talking about antisocial, serious behavioral problem. That needs to be absolutely stopped immediately and taken to a higher authority, because it's not really a classroom issue anymore. It's an institutional issue, and serious discipline needs to happen. So you're going to talk to your head of studies or your principal. Obviously, in really serious cases, you can get the police involved. So, with really major things, it's not about just giving them a little eye signal or walking closer. It's immediately, this is absolutely unacceptable. Let's deal with it now. Remove the student from the classroom and go and take them somewhere else. So if there's a behavior that you need to intervene on, take a deep breath for a second, think about, how big is this issue? If it's small, let me deal with it in a small way. If it's major, let me deal with that in a major way immediately. So those are some of the things that you can do to get rid of that negative behavior. So those are our level 3 leadership skills. And again, you might be good at some of them, you might not be good at some of them, but you need to practice them all the time. So it's the proactive things like the environmental management, physical and social environment, giving really great instructions, super clear instructions and communication, planning your lessons meticulously, and then of course managing issues as they come up. So that's the end of our podcast today, our level 3 issues. Next time, we're going to talk about classroom management or leadership, as I'm framing it, at levels 4 and 5 along the continuum that we're exploring. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I look forward to talking next time. Ka kite anō. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.